So for the math part of the lesson, we're going to show how beads and patterns describe lines. In the talking circle, students will be paired up. One student will draw a repeating pattern without the other partner seeing what they have drawn. They will then describe it to the partner who has a beadboard, and he will recreate it using beads. Once the partners are done, and each group has described the pattern they created from the description, whether they match, if they have any insights, etc., then the second round, with roles reversed between the partners, will be done, and then we'll have another round of sharing. Now, you might ask yourself, what kind of patterns will the students create? Well, we thought about that, and the first pattern we thought that a lot of students might create is a pattern of beads of one up and one to the right. And again, they would put another bead one up and one to the right, one up, one to the right, one up, and one to the right. Now, when they describe this to student B, they will put beads down on their board. And let's assume they didn't tell them where to put the first bead. So randomly, student B puts his first bead there. He goes one up and one to the right, one up, one to the right, and one up, one to the right. So he does 4, which is great, but he doesn't actually put it in the same place as student A. Now that's going to be a very rich discussion because placement on a graph is something that is very important. And so we're going to be able to talk about when we do a description of a pattern, we also have to consider where it's placed. Now, we can also assume that student A may describe it in a different way. They may start with the top bead, and they may describe it as one down and one to the left. One down, one to the left, one down, one to the left. Now that is also equally valid way to describe that pattern. So we'll be able to have that rich discussion. Now, another group of students we thought might actually create a line that goes in the other direction. So starting from the top, let's say, they may describe a line that goes 1 down and 2 to the right. I apologize, 1 down and 2 to the left. 1 down and 2 to the left. 1 down and 2 to the left. 1 down, 2 to the left. So you see that when they explain that to student B, and let's assume with this group, they actually do tell that student B where to place that first bead. So in the top right corner, he places his first bead, and he then places it 1 down, 2 to the left, 1 down, 2 to the left. Excellent, and he does this for 5 beads. So that's another kind of line. Now somebody could also explain it going the opposite direction. They could have said the first bead is placed 6 from the top left, 6 over and 5 down. And then describe that same pattern going 1 up and 2 to the right, 1 up, 2 to the right. Okay, so we've talked about placement. We've talked about various various slopes of the line. As we can see, these have 2 different slopes. One is steeper and one is less steep. And so we can also discuss what that difference is and what makes it steeper, what makes it less steep. Okay, so the other thing we can talk about is what if it's moving in the other direction? So if it's oppositely sloped, if the steepness is going in the opposite direction. Okay, so if we have a red bead, if A describes, I want you to start 5 beads down from the top left corner, then he might describe it as go down 2 and 1 to the right. Down 2, 1 to the right, and 1 more bead. Down 2, 1 to the right. So when he describes that to student B puts that on his beadboard. We're not going to show that because I think you guys are getting the idea. Now the other thing that you can talk to them about is what happens if we remove some of the beads? Would we still have the same pattern? So some students may make a pattern that, for instance, we may not even have to describe about removing beads right away. Some students might say 4 down and 2 to the right. So if, let's say they put a bead in the top left corner and they go down 4 and 2 to the right, down 4 and 2 to the right. You could say, oh, that is an interesting pattern. Could we maybe add beads to that one? Yeah, we could. So we could add a bead 2 down and 1 to the right. 2 down and 1 to the right. And so in doing that, we can show them that there's many ways to represent the same pattern. Now, it's the same pattern, but it isn't exactly the same number of beads or the same exact, um, you know, design. Now, some of these lines, yeah, they're lines if we draw a line through them, but they don't really look like great lines. So one of the things that we can talk about is, can we fill it in a little bit so it looks more like a line? And you'll see that in First Nations art where they actually will fill it in. Now, what we have to consider is when we're filling it in, we can't change at least one side of our line. One side of our line has to stay the same. And if we fill in behind it, we can make it look more like a line. So as you see, we're doing that. So now that looks like a thicker line. We haven't changed its pattern. We haven't changed how it looks really, except for the fact that we've just made it fatter. But now if we were to add all of a sudden start adding lines or adding dots to the other side of that line, well, now we've really changed the line. It's no longer going to be a line. So we can only add it to one side. And I think for now we will end our lesson there. But you can see how this can be utilized to show mathematical thinking in a way that students can develop their own thought processes and their own understanding, which we will later be able to relate to graphing and graphing equations.